Hello, everyone. It's time, and we also have quorum. I declare the meeting officially started. So, councillors who wish to speak during this meeting must show their faces via Zoom. The mute mics will only be unmute upon my request. So during this meeting, councillors need to use 3 different colors of background. I think everybody knows those well. So we now move on to the first item of our agenda. We will have meetings with the government. You may refer to the documents which list the agenda. I would first ask Mr. Roy Tang, JP Permanent Secretary for the Constitutional and Mainland Affairs Bureau, to offer a briefing about the emergency meeting pertaining to the 6th chief executive election, election date. And then after the briefing, we will have discussions. So, Secretary, are you here? If you're here, could you introduce the document to us? Is the officer here? Yes, unmuted. Good morning, everyone. So the 6th chief executive election date, last year in October, the government has already published that date. That date should have been 17th of March this year. So this date is set in accordance with the chief executive election laws. So after these election date has been set, we have always been working with the relevant departments to prepare necessary work for the elections. But starting this year, due to the trends exhibited by the COVID-19 pandemic, after lengthy considerations, the government, in order to guarantee that the chief executive elections could be held under a fair and transparent manner, in accordance with the law, the government has decided that the elections will be postponed to 8th of May this year for 2 major reasons. Firstly, we want to buy time in order to successfully fight the pandemic so that the pandemic may subside. Because even though the chief executive election the vote is cast by 1,500 members of the electoral committee, but people understand that the chief executive election is an election which involves the entire Hong Kong public. There will be campaigns, and it's not just about the 1,500 electoral committee members. So due to practical concerns under the pandemic, we cannot have those campaigns. Secondly, if we want to delay an election, we have to take into consideration the relevant provisions of the basic law. According to Hong Kong law, the term of the chief executive will end by 30th of June this year. So if the newly elected chief executive is elected and appointed by the central government, he or she will take time to form a cabinet, so we cannot postpone the date for too long. And thirdly, according to the current laws, there is a possibility, which may or may not come to pass, which has been taken into consideration, is that during the first round of votes, let's say we cannot elect a CE. If that's the case, according to the law, we must terminate that particular election. And on the date of the termination, in accordance with the law, we must postpone the election by 40 days to the first Sunday after 40 days, and that would be the second round of votes. So we must make preparations. If that happens, we cannot postpone the election date for too long. So if that eventuality comes to pass, we could still, in accordance with the law, host another round of vote before the 30th of June. So that's why we have settled on the date of 8th of May. So this regulation is actually in accordance with the emergency laws And there are 5 major portions. Firstly, the first part, it must cancel. It must cancel the original date of the original announced date of 27th of March of the elections, and to cancel the other announcement pertaining to the declaration of the chief executive election date. And then there is also another date, which is the date of taking effect. That's the 14th of February. So after that date, everything pertaining to the chief executive election, all the activity, all electoral staff, and all people who have declared that they would participate in the election, we must make relevant provisions in order to guarantee their rights and then secondly, we must set a new election date, as I've mentioned. And number 4, even though the election is terminated, but in Hong Kong law, we have relevant electoral laws. And the electoral law says that in any election, not necessarily the CE election, anybody who has declared that they would participate in the election, they have relevant obligation. And most importantly of which is to declare the expenses and to declare the ad campaigns that they are doing for the election. And there are other relevant provisions as well. Even though the election has terminated, those laws will still take effect. And finally, before the 24th of February, these people who have said that they will be interested in participating in the election in the future, if they would like to join the election again, we must guarantee their rights as well. Specifically speaking, the campaign funding that they have already spent will be reset. In other words, all the expenditure pertaining to their previous campaigns will be recalculated starting from the 24th of February. So everything spent before the 24th of February will be reset. And they have already said that they are a candidate now, and that previous declaration from a legal point of view will no longer be regarded as a declaration for the sake of the new election dated the 8th of May. So everything is going to be reset. So Chairman, that's all I have to say, and myself and my colleagues from the Secretary of Justice office are more than willing to answer any questions. So I would ask everybody to drop your hands for a moment, and then I would say that everybody could raise your hand, and then you raise your hand. Now you can raise your hand. So I think that this is an important piece of legislation, and it's a new one. So I would give everybody 5 minutes. 5 minutes per round. And I think there will be more than one round of speakers. There will be round 2, round 3. I know that everybody has dedicated their time to this endeavor. So I hope that everybody get a chance to speak. But if you repeat your question, or if people have already asked the question that you asked, I would gently remind you. So even though we have time to discuss this law, we don't have too much time. So after we have dealt with all your questions today, I would start my clause by clause. So now what I see, there is Lo Wai Kwok, Alice Mack. I don't have the names there, and also Dick Chi Yun. Okay, and also Can Wai Man, Carmen. And also Te Wai Chun. So 5 people. Will there be more people? Or I honestly can't tell. Okay, well, there are a lot of people here, but their hands are not up yet. So I'll start with Mr. Lo Wai Kwok. Thank you, Chairman. So, Chairman, we are now facing the 5th wave of COVID-19 pandemic. And it's very, very serious right now. Yesterday, in a single day, there were 55,000 plus people who got infected. As a matter of fact, right now, people are isolating at their own homes, and a lot of citizens who are infected with mild symptoms, they would just sit at their own home and wait till they cure. And some of my friends experience just that. So frankly, the government asked people to register their infection. So, well, whether or not they would like to register if they are already cured, that's a problem. And even if you register right now, the government offers no support to families at home. So both the economy and the livelihoods are severely impacted. And of course, our first priority right now is, as our President Xi Jinping has said, we must do everything to stabilize the pandemic first. Lives are most important. Lives come first. So we must fight the pandemic first and foremost. In face of this serious situation, all departments of the government and all our government officials, be they civil servants or politically appointed officials, they must work together to resist the pandemic, to fight the pandemic. Because of that, the government has used their emergency powers to postpone the election to the 8th of May. And my party expresses our support and understanding of this action. This is a practical thing to do. So just now, Mr. Roy Tang have said, he has described clearly why the date is set on the 5th of May, as on the 8th of May. And indeed, we have the 30th of June deadline to take into consideration as well. Therefore, I think that the choice is an appropriate one. Just now, Mr. Roy Tang has also mentioned some other matters pertaining to the election, which has happened already. For example, somebody has already declared their interest to join the election, and they have incurred certain expenses already. And I see in my groups that people are campaigning, trying to raise funds, etc. I would like to Mr. Roy Tang to explain. So even though the election is the date has postponed, will the election fund will be reset, or will the expenditures still count? That's the one thing that I need clarification for. And secondly, there are a lot of previous legal announcements pertaining to the original date of the election. So fortunately now they are no longer in effect. But when the electoral committee is involved, the voters in the CE election are involved. Well, there's no reason to restart that all over, because that's a fait accompli. Who's a voter and who would be a voter by virtue of a position he or she holds, like those things are set in stone already. So I would like the Permanent Secretary to explain these matters for us.
Thank you, Dr. Low, for your question. On expenses, we'll have to look at it in two different concepts. First of all is the discontinued election, and the other is the postponed election, which is to be held on May 8th. So we have to look at this separately. For the discontinued election, for any person who has publicly declared himself as a candidate and who has incurred election expenses, that person has the responsibility to provide an election return. So he or she will still need to declare it under the Elections Corrupt and Illegal Conduct Ordinance. So we'll have to make an election return. But then the expenses on the new election, which is the postponed election on May 8th, the election expenses will be reset. It will start again at 0. So when this person publicly declared the intention to stand as a candidate, then the expenses will be reset. And in accordance with the Elections Corrupt and Legal Conduct Ordinance, that person will need to ensure that any unused election donation be given to a charitable institution or trust of a public character chosen by them. So that is in accordance with the ordinances. So that is basically my response to the first part. On the second part, on the notice for members of EC, if you all recall, in March 11th of last year, the NPC amended Appendix 1 and 2, and now there is very clear instructions on the decision of the Electoral Committee. Now there is a constitutional responsibility to also elect the CE together with the legislative councillors. Therefore, any notices in relation to the elections after it has been approved by the CRC, then there will be legal notices on that, and that will not actually be affected by this provision, because at that time, that is only to confirm the eligibility of the members, and that has no direct connection with the CE election. That has nothing to do with their eligibility. Therefore, the members' eligibility criteria will not be changed. Any follow-up questions? Chairman, for the first part of the question, for persons who have showed their intention to stand as a candidate, those candidates did not say that they were only going to run for the March election. Of course, that person could say that, but then usually these candidates would continue standing for the election till May. Would you consider that the work is in continuation and that the expenses incurred would not be reset? PS. Any election that has been completed or been discontinued under the Elections Corrupt and Legal Conduct Ordinance, that persons will have 60 days to lodge an election return. So this provision has not been amended. Therefore, that person will still need to comply with these obligations. We have previously amended a similar provision on the Legislative Council election. And we handled those in the same way, that expenses already incurred will not be counted. It would be reset in the new election. We did consider this in the draft, that every person or every candidate has his or her own way of incurring expenses. Some people use 90% right in the beginning. Some people use only a very small amount. Therefore, we cannot let the candidate bring along the expenses to the new election, because that would be unfair. Therefore, in order to conduct the election in a fair and just manner, we must reset the expenses for each new election. PS, I'd like to follow up on Dr. Lo's question. I understand all your points. Take, for example, I'm going to run for the election. I have raised 1 million. I spent 500,000. Now you're saying that I have to reset my expenses. But then, as you said, we cannot keep the funds. I'm not trying to pocket the funds, but let's say since you're now postponing the election to May 8th, and for personal reasons, I decided not to run for the May election, and I understand that I must donate the money to a charity. Well, the funds I raised have not been used, would not need to be donated to charity, right? Because if I want to continue with the election, I can continue using that, or I would need to donate this to charity first and then raise funds again for a new election. Basically, you would need to comply with the same or regulation. We cannot estimate how much money would be spent in running for a new election. But when an election has been completed within 60 days, the candidates would be required to lodge an election return and to give out the donation to a charitable institution. So basically, the candidates would not be able to keep the money. And this is a regulation under the Elections Corrupt and Illegal Conduct Ordinance. There are two considerations when you receive donations. The money may come from unknown channels, and therefore, those who donated would not take back the money. Well, let me try to follow up. The money I raised has not been used. I still need to donate this money. Am I correct? And then in April, when I decide to run again, I'll have to raise new funds again. So any donations made can not be extended, and the money received must be donated. Am I clear in that? Yes, you are correct. Let me read out the names. Well, I'm a bit relaxed in time today because Dr. Lo's question is a really good reference for us. Ms. Alice Mac, Dr. Dick Ji Yun, Mr. Tony, Ms. Nixie Lam. Ms. Alice Mac, please. Chairman. Since we're postponing the election date, the next nomination period would be in April. However, there is news that there would be a universal compulsory testing scheme carried out in end March. Would that actually overlap with the CE election period and that it wouldn't affect the CE election? Let's say, unfortunately, the epidemic could still not be contained by that time. So what would be these criteria in which the administration will continue with the election? Because many people are afraid that the pandemic would affect the CE period. People expect to see the CE election and that there be a new government in the new term. So how will the government ensure that we'll be able to see a new government on July 1st of this year? P.S. The overriding mission at present is to contain the pandemic. We're going to mobilize all resources to fight the epidemic. I've said earlier that we have two considerations in the CE election. First of all, well, if there's more than one candidate, then the election committee and members of the public must have an opportunity to hear about the election platform policies. So that is the basic criteria of the Electoral Affairs Commission, because if candidates cannot share their election platform, then that would not be a fair election. And the second consideration is that an indefinite postponement of the election, well, although chances are minimal, that it might be possible that the candidate cannot obtain at least 750 votes to be elected. And therefore, there would be a need to postpone the CE election once again. So we must also consider this possibility. And then to postpone the election again. Now, of course, we will try our best to ensure that we'll be able to carry out the CE election as planned. And it is clear under the basic law that the term for CE is 5 years, and there will not be any changes to that. We can only work towards that goal to try our best. Well, even if the epidemic is contained, we're still going to take all measures to ensure that it would be safe for the election to be carried out. Yes, members of the public are expecting to see the CE election and a new governing body on July 1st. Therefore, I hope that the government, other than working towards fighting the epidemic with the support of the central government, will be able to contain the pandemic, but you must also come up with a contingency plan. Maybe we can only stabilize the outbreak at this moment. We still have to consider how to carry out the CE election. I hope you would consider these contingencies to ensure that we'll be able to carry out the election as planned. Any follow-up? Well, this is also our view. Well, I can share with the chairman and Ms. Mack that we only have about 90 people in the CMAB. Although you hear that most civil servants are working from home, actually 95% of our staff, other than those who are feeling unwell or who are pregnant, are working towards fighting the pandemic. So be rest assured we will do our best.
Next, Councillor Dick Ji-Yuen. Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to thank our colleagues and everybody else who is doing a lot of work during the pandemic. As the Secretary has said, that our civil servants are working hard, but hard work is hard work. But as a matter of fact, this situation is worrying. The Permanent Secretary just said that there are two considerations behind deciding the date of the elections. The first is the pandemic, and the second is the constitution requirement for electing a new chief executive before the 30th of June. Of course, I agree with that assessment, and I really hope that we could have an election by May. But I find the situation rather worrying, and I'm somewhat pessimistic. I think that the deadline, as Mr. Roy Tang has said, is 1st of July. It cannot change. And I understand this is a complicated matter. If you cannot elect a new chief executive by the 1st of July, that would violate the basic law, and it would be very complicated. I understand that this is the deadline. But let's say the pandemic continue to worsen and we cannot continue. So we hope that the pandemic would improve. That's why we postponed it to May. That's why during the election, there would be a better campaign and more people get to participate in the election. Everybody wants to see that. But unfortunately, in face of the deadline, if the situation does not improve by May, should we force things through? If we do force it through, wouldn't that be contradictory position of the government's own plans? So do you have a plan A, plan B, plan C? If let's say the pandemic worsens, the situation worsens, if society is even getting worse and worse, do you have a plan B in place? And let's say, hypothetically speaking, unfortunately, let's say some of our electoral committee members got COVID. How do we vote then? Or even sadder, like one of the candidates get infected. How do we handle the election then? Like, has the government considered those eventualities? Roy Tang, please. Thank you, Chairman. As a matter of fact, according to the regulations that we have submitted to everyone, this is the only plan we have right now with regards to the election date. This is the only proposal we have. So with regards to various proposals, I hope that Councillor Dick would understand that the government must act in accordance with the law, with the basic law, and the government is subject to the limitations of the basic law when it comes to changing the laws. So anything which has to postpone the election date beyond the 1st of July, that's not something that the government has the power to do. I think everybody understands that. We must do everything to fight the pandemic here at the government, and we hope that we can get the support of society at large and everybody else, all of our citizens. So with regards to different eventualities you've mentioned, let's say the electoral committee members are infected and they cannot cast their votes. We have plans for that. We have provisions for that already. And we have quarantine hotels, and we have arrangements for votes to be cast in those quarantine hotels as well. I think earlier on, as people may remember, during the LegCo elections, we already have the relevant facilities set up at Penny Bay. But in the end, fortunately, it was not necessary. So we would work with the FHB and the CDC to talk about how to guarantee a safe and secure electoral environment. We have all these procedures in place already, and this is something that we can handle totally. So another hypothesis that you've raised just now is, let's say a candidate got infected. That may happen during the election. So the law does not prohibit the candidate to continue his or her campaign in another manner. So a slight follow-up. I'd like to confirm, even if the pandemic is more severe than it is now, before the 1st of July, in other words, the only proposal is the 8th of May proposal. No matter what happens, this will go ahead. Is that what you're saying? Chairman, my explanation just now is as follows. Right now, the government, when submitting this proposals, this law, we only have one new election date, the 8th of May. So we, of course, will fight the pandemic with all we have. But let's say if there are new developments and new environment, we have to take that into consideration. But at the current stage, we do not have another proposal. Next. Honorable Carmen Kan Waiman. Thank you, Chairman. I have the following questions for Mr. Roy Tang, the Permanent Secretary for the CMAB. So firstly, as Chairman, you have previously mentioned, after the 11th of March decision has been published by the National People's Congress, the Xinhua Newsnet said that there was a huge round of applause in the congressional halls. So I would like to learn from the government after the electoral system has been improved, the Hong Kong people and the Chinese people all wish to see that the first election after the improved electoral system, the 6th CE election, could be held successfully on time. So I hope that the CMAB and the entire government would seriously fight the pandemic with all they have in order to guarantee that the elections could be held on time. And as Mr. Roy Tang has said, that the Article 46 of the Basic Law says that the CE has a 5-year term that's stipulated by the Basic Law, and the government has no power to change the term limits. And we also noticed that the National People's Congress has clearly stated their powers under the Appendix 1 of the Basic Law, and they have every right to make amendments to that. So I hope that the Hong Kong government understands their constitutional duty. And we have to do this well. We have to handle this postponement of election situation properly. And right now, by my view, the government does not have a centralized command center which offers centralized information about the pandemic yet, including in the last line of this report, it says that the CE is reported to the Chinese people's government, hoping that the Chinese people government would understand and support them. So the prerequisite here, the Chinese government's understanding and support for the Hong Kong government is to implement all the necessary measures to fight the pandemic and to do everything we can. And this is very important for the sake of the election. I would like to emphasize that point once more. And furthermore, with regards to the arrangements of the election, in the third page, Part A of the document, this time in accordance with Cap 599G, it bans any gathering of 2 or more people. We have to we have to factor in those considerations. That's why we have delayed the elections from the 3rd to the 16th. But we heard from CE said that we would maintain these measures until 20th of April. But of course, we see that according to the law, every extension lasts for 14 days, and right now it is extended to 9th of March. The 599G will be extended to 9th of March. If you extend it by 14th day at a time, and you extend it to the 20th of April, so I would like to ask, from the 3rd of April to the 20th of April, how would you have the nominations? So originally, the reason behind extending the nomination period is because of the 599G limitations on gatherings of 2 or more people, and and you said that this would limit the meaningful campaign of candidates fighting for the nomination. So how would you carry out the 20th of April? Have you considered that taking that into consideration? And secondly, is on the same page on Part B. The current election arrangements, because it will be hosted at the HKCEC, there's only one polling station. I would like to ask, is that a legal requirement or is that just an electoral arrangement? So if we must have this election, do you have plans or contingency plans to change the polling station arrangement so that people could reduce you could reduce the congregation of people? So I would like to ask, there being one polling station, is that an administrative measure or a legal requirement? My third question. Just now, Councillor Dick has asked the same question. The election on the 8th of May. According to paragraph 17 of your document, the Electoral Organization Committee could, in situations where public health is threatened, delay the elections for 14 days. is that one of the considerations that is that one of the things that you might consider? Like, could you delay the election for 14 days after the 8th of May? So I'll have the first three questions. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Roy Tang, please. So the law has a requirement under the Chief Executive Electoral Laws 541G, Article J, paragraph 18. It clearly stipulates that they would select one location as the polling station. But I think people could take solace in the fact that the size of the polling station and the all the relevant provisions and arrangements is very important. We would definitely find an appropriate location to guarantee that the election could be held in a safe and orderly manner. So that's my response on the one polling station issue, because the law requires there being one polling station. It doesn't have to be HKCEC. Anywhere which could guarantee the safe and secure election is worth considering. And secondly, it's about the currently under Cap 599G, the limits on congregation. So every time it is amended in accordance with the law, and as you have seen, sometimes we would add certain locations, sometimes we would reduce the number of venues, sometimes we would add certain limitations, sometimes we would reduce the limitations. And in accordance with the law, we could amend the details pertaining to the ordinance, and in an appropriate, and we can guarantee the smooth operation of the CE elections. But that's merely a hypothetical thing that the law could do. But as what Carmen Can-Weiman has said, that our first priority is to fight the pandemic, and we hope that as the pandemic subsides, we could host the CE elections successfully. Any follow-up, Councillor Kan? So Mr. Roy Tang have yet to answer my question about the possible postponement of the 8th of May election. Thank you, Chairman. As a matter of fact, under the law, if we want to delay the election by 14 days, one of the possibilities is that there would be public health risks. That's a fact. That power is held by the Electoral Organization Committee, and every postponement only lasts for 14 days. So, every time we delay it for 14 days, that's a recurring event every time we do it. And when we made the proposal, we have thought about using these powers, and we would ask the Electoral Organization Committee to postpone the election by 14 days. But if we do that, the citizens may have questions like, we are only postponing this series elections by 14 days, and after the first postponement, will there be a further postponement of another fortnight? So in the previous Legislative Council election, that happened, and the society understood that this was not an appropriate use of that type of power, because when we drafted the law, we intend for this power to be used when there is high certainty. So that's why we decided to change the dates with another manner to make sure that all candidates know when the election will be postponed. I understand that you will not use the 14-day postponement in the previous postponement, but by the 8th of May, if you postpone that by 14 days, that would be 22nd of May. So there's 22nd of May, there's still a feasible amount of time for the government to form a cabinet. Would you consider doing that? Like not using it this time, I understand that. But by the 8th of May, that situation will be more foreseeable. It could be more foreseeable that the pandemic will be under control. So have you considered that option?
Of course, you have already mentioned that that would be under the powers of the EAC. Well, thank you. Well, of course, we will not rule out the possibility. We have considered invoking such powers, but then when there is a need, we would, of course, ask the EAC to reconsider. Well, there are too many hypotheses here. I think that is very hard for the PS to give you responses as there are too many uncertainties. Next, Mr. Tony Tse. Thank you. We all understand the severity of the epidemic. Postponing the CE election will allow us to focus on fighting the pandemic, and that is an appropriate method. The CE's term will end on June 30th. Postponing the CE election to May 8th, after listening to the PS explanation, makes me feel that May 8th is not actually a deadline. We'll still be able to elect the sixth term chief executive by July 1st. Am I understanding this correctly? Yes, that we are working towards the election date to be carried out on May 8th. However, based on the current situation, if there is a need to further postpone the election, we still have adequate time. My second question is that in the Legislative Council election, there was a previous question on the election expenses. This time, the postponement differs from the one-year extension of Legislative Council. Time is very tight right now. Would PS clarify the guidelines that expenses on campaigns and banners could cover the period between February 20th and March 4th? And are there any guidelines on how you view these expenses? Because some of the expenses incurred may only be until February 23rd or around that time. Last time when we postponed the Legislative Council election, some expenses could be returned. Would this also be the same for the postponement of the CE election? All right, there are three questions. On the first question on whether the expenses could be returned, this situation differs from the Legislative Council election postponement. The election was postponed after the nomination period of the LC election. Tens and hundreds of nominations were received, and at that time the emergency ordinance was also invoked, and it specifies that if a candidate has already submitted a nomination, then all the expenses would be returned. So at that time, there was such an arrangement because the registration and electoral office returned all those expenses. But then this time it's different because nominations have not been made for this election. Therefore, we would not have a
跨期使費嘅問題，其實呢個同一般選舉
mechanism in returning the expenses.
根據法例咧就係
In accordance with the law, election expenses are expenses incurred before the election, during the election, and after the election. And those expenses
叫做選舉經費。
were expenses used to support the candidate in his or her election. As long as the candidate has incurred expenses during the election, then
終止日期真係要24號之前俾個租金咧。
of course, it could be carried on. But then for expenses incurred before February 24th, and it would be reset this time.
同其他選舉
This
都
arrangement is consistent with other election arrangements. Chairman, I would like to follow up on the last response. For rent, let's say, that carries over February 24th. Let's say that candidate has already paid for the rent and the office rented will be continue to be in use, that the candidate has already paid for 2 months rent and it carries on over February 24th. Now, let's say the office will continue to be used. Would you also provide guidelines on how that would be calculated? Would you be calculating that on a pro rata basis after February 24th? There is no such detail in the provisions, but then we could refer to how the REO deals with it. So when the candidate lodges an election return within 60 days, then there would be a calculation given. Usually you would have a cutoff date on the election date. For rent that has been paid before February 21st, and these expenses would already be included, but then you will be able to reset it for the next nomination period. So this is a very clear principle. However, Mr. Tse has raised a very good question. Let's say the candidate has already designed a banner and has paid for the banner design. But then, because of the election being discontinued, expenses used before February 24th should be included. However, the banner has not yet been printed. So the printing part would then be included in the expenses for the next election period. Thank you. Mr. Lam Center. Thank you, Chairman. I'm a member of the election committee, so I'd like to declare interest. We've seen a surging number of confirmed cases in the last 2 days, about 50,000 a day, and the severity has actually exceeded the numbers in the United States. So we cannot estimate how many cases we would see in April and May, and we're not certain whether it would become more severe by then. if there is a need to further postpone the C election, let's say more than 14 days. We are now invoking this regulation under the Emergency Regulations Ordinance. However, this cannot override the basic law. Do you have a contingency plan? Let's say we really need to further postpone the CE election. What can we do? Do we have to bring this up to the NPC Standing Committee? I'd like to remind members not to raise so many hypothetical questions, but PS, please address his question. Well, let me try to answer this hypothetical legal question. Yes, the CE is appointed by the central government. As the NPC is the highest authority, any decisions made can override the basic law. And we have seen this occur in the Legislative Council election. But the Hong Kong SAR government will not comment on the decisions made by the NPC. Do you have any follow-up, Mr. Lam? Well, so I agree that we could not override the basic law on this, right? Yes. Well, we have members, Ms. Nexi Lam, and other members who have raised their hands. Ms. Nexi Lam, please. Thank you. The DAB understands the postponement of the C election. We believe it is an appropriate arrangement, and we must now put all our efforts in fighting the epidemic. It's now very severe because those infected are not only hospital frontline staff, it's now everywhere. Therefore, we must ensure that we can contain the pandemic, because only by doing that can we be able to ensure that we'll have patriots administering Hong Kong. It is actually quite common to postpone an election during the pandemic. It has happened overseas. I have a question that since the pandemic is very severe right now, although we are trying our best to contain the fifth wave, we must ensure that we carry out a safe election. Has the government considered when an election can be carried out? What are the standards you are going to follow? Of course, many experts have said that we are not going to comply with a zero infection.
Mr. Roy Tang. So, anything about the way that to fight the pandemic and assess the pandemic, we need to refer to the opinions of the experts at the health experts employed by the Hong Kong government. So we at the CMAB, we are trying our best to organize one election. So about the number of infections and the situation of pandemic, what is suitable for hosting the election, just as in our current proposal, we would ask our health experts for their opinion. So right now, here and now, we cannot offer clear indicators and clear estimates about what may or may not happen in the future about the pandemic. Thank you. So any follow-up question?
頭先俾人 mute 咗，咁我係咪可以理解其實而家暫時係冇預案，亦都冇一條線去到邊，要到時睇情況，跟住再去釐定，即係你哋就要同 CHP 嗰邊去釐定翻個係 OK 定係唔 OK，ready 定係唔 ready 去選舉咧？係。
多謝主席。原則我哋得兩個嘅啫。正如行政長官亦都即係多次講過，就係首先我哋要疫情得到舒緩啦，令到選舉可以公平、公開、安全咁進行啦。第二就係必須要考慮埋下一屆政府嘅需要，因為理論上你可以好遲去選舉咧，都仍然符合基本法，即係嗰個行政長官任期嘅死線嘅。咁但係咁樣做嘅唔好處咧，就係下一屆嘅政府係基本上完全冇早班嘅時間，咁樣亦都唔係一個理想嘅做法嚟嘅。咁所以現任政府係必須要負責任咁樣作出一個建議啦，因為我哋而家講緊嘅都係一個月前嘅建議啦，即係個安排我哋必須係要負責任咁樣去作出一個建議，亦都盡力咁樣去執行。咁一方面就係抗擊疫情啦，一方面就係我哋冇間斷過嘅呢個選舉嘅準備嚇。多謝主席。
呢個選舉完咗之餘咧，新任行政長官咧，佢又要早咗班咧，亦都要中央去拍板。咁呢啲冚唪唥都有時間，即係我好難睇到話我哋6月30押後到去選行政長官，選到佢出嚟個晏晝，跟住佢要諗，哇！我10幾個司局長。跟住諗完呢班人，仲話要拎上去北京，要北京去任命。咁有陣時有啲嘢係一定，我諗係要有啲時間去配合呢個即係新班子同埋新嘅行政長官上任嘅咯。阿林議員，你仲有冇問題要跟進？
好啦，唔該。
OK，下一位黃國議員。
多謝主席。喺而家疫情咧每日創新高嘅情況下面咧，去延期嗰個嘅特首選舉，我覺得呢個係好合理嘅，因為呢個係對於集中精力去處理疫情咧，呢個係非常之重要。但另一方面咧，我都想了解一下，因為我覺得我哋未來，因為香港好多市民都期望嘅疫情之後咧，都希望能夠選出一個好嘅特首咧，去推動解決香港好多經濟社會民生嘅難題。咁樣唔單止可能要選出一個嘅特首，特別要仲要選好嘅特首裏面咧，我哋一面對兩個嘅情況，一個就話嗰個嘅行政長官嘅選舉嘅週期係短好多啊！以前可能喺舊年嘅11月份咧，已經好多人都會宣佈出嚟參選啦啊！咁嘅時候咧，係一方面就係令到選委又好，市民又好，點樣去了解認識嗰個嘅特首嘅候選人咧？另一方面，即使係延遲到5月嘅選舉嘅話咧，到時候咧可能疫情都係受到疫情嘅威脅下面。咁嘅時候，我就想問兩個嘅問題，就係喺嗰個嘅特首選舉嘅競選嘅週期好短嘅時間下面咧，有冇咩特別嘅措施係令到市民特別係選委更加能夠了解特首候選人嘅政綱？譬如話係咪將來都要搞一個嘅視像嘅特首選嘅論壇咧，係令到特首同候選人之間特首同埋選舉委員會嘅選舉委員會嘅委員咧有一個更加好嘅一個嘅溝通。第二方面就係點樣去順利去交接問題啦。5月份出咗嚟之後咧，到6月底啊，即係7月1號咧就要直接去有一個嘅新嘅班子上場。咁嘅時候特區政府有冇咩特別嘅措施去支持或者支援咧呢一個順利嘅交接？因為可能到時好多特首又好，或者係嗰啲局長未必熟悉政府嘅運作嘅時候咧，點樣更加快咧進入嗰個嘅角色？所以喺呢個情況下面咧，就想問政府有冇咩喺特別嘅時間有冇特殊嘅措施去保證咧選出嘅特首同埋一個順利嘅交接？唔該。
秘書長。
關於黃議員提出嗰個視像論壇嗰個建議咧，其實以往嘅行政長官選舉如果有搞辯論嘅時候，我記得港台啊，以至其他嘅電子傳媒都有做嘅。咁呢個實際上法例就冇限制佢哋去做呢一類咁樣嘅論壇嘅。咁當然即係一個非常之好嘅主意啦。咁以至行政長官候選人本身，其實佢都可以透過即係電子媒介去接觸選委，以至接觸廣大市民嘅。其實呢個完全做得到嘅。 咁就住嗰個交接嘅問題咧，其實大家都可能記得就係每一次嘅行政長官選舉完咗之後咧，其實係會動用即係特區政府即係政府嘅資源啦，係用公帑咧，係為佢設立一個行政長官嘅候任行政長官嘅辦公室嘅。咁就一般嘅人員咧就會包括佢會有佢嘅常任秘書長啦，佢嘅私人秘書啦，其實同現在嘅現任嘅行政長官嗰個人員嘅數目係好接近，秘書啊、專車啊、保衛啊呢啲全部都會為佢提供嘅。咁當然一個正常安排就係會由即係特區政府負責嘅官員向佢以至佢嘅團隊提供一切所需關於現任政府嘅政策啦、文件啦、解說啦，呢啲以前全部都會做嘅。而家當然亦都喺疫情嘅情況之下，如果當時係未消退嘅時候，當然亦都會有一個適合嘅形式去進行呢一類嘅交接活動。咁特區政府其實係完全有責任去支持候任行政長官佢嗰個工作嘅。我哋係完全唔會吝嗇任何資源同埋人力去保證佢能夠順利接任一個行政長官。多謝主席。
有冇跟進？
主席，我想追問一下，我覺得係正常嘅情況，頭先常任秘書長講咧就係一種正常嘅情況下嘅運作，但係而家今次嘅選舉咧就係成個選舉時間係壓縮咗，同埋咧交接嘅時間壓縮咗，所以我都想了解政府裏面咧喺咁樣嘅情況特殊情況之下裏面咧有冇啲特別嘅措施能夠咧令到成個選舉更加順利，同埋交接順利。
多謝主席。其實嗰個選舉嘅時間咧，佢即係講清楚，就係嗰個法例入邊咧就只有2個時間嘅啫，咁亦都係冇壓縮到嘅。第一個就係嗰個提名期啦，14天，我哋係刻意唔改呢啲咁樣嘅法例嘅期限嘅，因為正正就係好似黃議員咁擔心，就係你改咗佢，咁唔通得2日提名期咩？咁冇可能噶嘛，因為你又要攞5個界別188個提名，咁14日係冇改到嘅。另外咧，法例都規定咧，就係呢個提名期完結嘅日子必須係行政長官選舉之前嘅21天。咁呢個我哋傳統上唔係法例稱呼㗎，就叫做競選期，就係頭先講到嗰啲去見市民啊、見選委啊、做論壇啊，呢21日咧，我哋又係刻意。唔係
常秘，我想講嗰時阿叔咧就係特首候選人宣布參選到嗰個選出嚟咧，以前嘅時間咧，可能係喺舊年嘅，可能11、12月份已經宣布啦嘛，到選，即係一個好長嘅時間，令到市民或者選委更加了解熟悉候選人嗰個嘅政綱嗰啲理念。喺而家咁縮短下面咧，點樣能夠有咩措施啊，令到呢一個嘅壓縮嘅時間裏面咧，令到選委或者市民咧喺短嘅時間裏面能夠更加了解熟悉我哋特首候選人嗰個嘅政綱咯。
係
秘書長，
多謝主席。任何嘅參選人咧，佢幾時決定公開宣布參選咧？呢個就唔係我哋法例有要求嘅。至於係咪今屆特別長、特別短咧？呢個實際上唔係喺特區政府嘅控制範圍。我哋能夠做好嘅咧，就係任何嘅參選人如果
can make sure is that any candidate, if they want to conduct their campaign in a fair and transparent manner, of course, we would support that. Just like the EAC, they would have detailed electoral guidelines so that they would know their rights. There are also online platforms for them to put their ad campaign materials there, and those would continue. So I'd like to add the nomination period and the end of the nomination period and the election day, like that. Those dates have not, that time period is not shorter than before, right? No, not shorter at all. So this is not a really compressed campaign. There's no compressed nomination, etc. So next question would come from Councillor Lam Siu Lo and Andrew. So thank you, Chairman. I would like to learn about during the nomination period and when the votes are cast during the pandemic. Let's say certain situations come to pass. I would like to confirm whether my understanding of Mr. Roy Tang's explanation are correct about those matters. So during the nomination period, it's not just the candidate is contacting with the electoral committee members. There are other works, procedures pertaining to fair submission of application forms, etc. So the entire process is very important to the fairness of the election. So just now, Mr. Roy Tang, his answer to some previous question of my colleagues is that under the 599G ordinance, there is some flexibility. And furthermore, during the vote, I might not have caught your answer properly. You said that during the LegCo elections, that there were special arrangements made at Penny Bay, but later on, you also said that the law stipulates that the polling station is one singular location, regardless of where it exactly is. So, under that context, I would like to understand. Currently, given the laws that we have, if let's say we host the election during the pandemic, we are guaranteed that the elections are fair and transparent. Does that mean that we have to provide enough flexibility in 599G in order to achieve that? Is that the permanent secretary's response pertaining to the two previous questions? Is my understanding correct? Mr. Roy Tang, please. So let's say in the LegCo election example, as you remember, there were limitations under the 599G ordinance, and at a point there were no congregations beyond 20 people, and you can all indoor venues were operating at half capacity. But because in the end the pandemic did not hit, so we did not initiate those procedures. And one of the proposals we had back then is that we would create a special exemption for the sake of elections. But in the end, we did not need to do that because the pandemic was under control. So we have always made contingency plans about these matters. And we know that we have to amend the orders under 599G in order to achieve that. And we would definitely take that into consideration. Any follow-up? No further follow-up. Thank you, Chairman. So next question comes from Councillor Tang Fei. Thank you. So I have three questions. Firstly, according to the 45th article of the Basic Law, the chief executive could be elected via election or in negotiations. So election or negotiation, is that something that the Hong Kong government could decide by ourselves, or do we have to submit the proposals to the National People's Congress Standing Committee for their decision? And previously, there were media reports saying that if the pandemic worsens, we could not preclude the possibility of not hosting the elections and electing an official by way of negotiation. So you at the CMAB, have you considered these eventualities? And the second question is that today, under the emergency law, we are postponing the elections to the 8th of May. So just now, the Permanent Secretary has said that this law that we are looking at right now, it provides only one date, the 8th of May. But under the Electoral Affairs Committee, they have another flexibility to postpone the election by 14 days. I'd like to ask, if, let's say, touch wood, if the 8th of May doesn't work out, the EAC could postpone the date by 14 days more. In other words, we will no longer need to have another emergency law, and the EAC could unilaterally make that decision then. If that's the case, under what conditions could the EAC make such a decision, and when will they notify us? That's a very important point that needs to be clarified. And finally, even though it's a hypothetical question, but I think this has a very different, this is a very different situation from the October LegCo elections, because the October situation is not as bad as we're seeing right now. Back then, we were talking about both local legislations and other elections. You can access the HKCEC polling station as long as you take your temperature. So I would like to ask, on the 8th of May elections, should the electoral committee members or conduct a rapid test on themselves before they enter the polling station. In other words, they have to test negative before accessing the polling station. That's a very important arrangement. It's not necessary. Are you saying that it's not necessary? Because the law does not mandate that, they could just go there and cast the vote. Let's say if they enter and they vote and then they come back out and then they test positive, and then the subsequent electoral committee members, they may not be brave, they may not dare to enter the polling station and vote. So if we mandate that all electoral committee members must test negative before they access the polling station, could that be, would that create another situation where the rights of the electoral committee members to cast their vote will be infringed upon?
Yes. That is a very clear provision under the basic law. Well, there is only one regulation, which is CAP 569 on the election of the chief executive. So I can tell you very clearly that if we are to elect a chief executive within Hong Kong, then we can only use the chief executive election provision under the basic law. That is very clear. Secondly, on the election committee and on the postponement of 14 days, we cannot just postpone the election committee other than riots or any risk of public health and public interest. Therefore, we cannot just make changes to the EC because any decisions made by the EC chair could also be challenged. Our understanding is that for any election, for persons who cannot vote will actually be revoking the rights of the voters. In the last Legislative Council election, many eligible voters were not able to return to Hong Kong due to various reasons. Therefore, we arranged for mobile voting stations at the borders. We foresee that there may be someone who is febrile, and therefore we sterilized the polling stations. We estimate the routing used by the voters and sterilized and disinfected everything. So please do not worry. Dr. Simon Lee, we are in support of postponing the election because we are sure that the government will carry out a very smooth and fair election. I just want to follow up on the question on election expenses. Let's say a candidate has raised $100, he spent $50, and the remaining $50, in my understanding, must be donated, right? It cannot be saved to be used in May. Am I correct? Yes. After the completion of the election or after the discontinued election, any unused election donation must be given to a charitable institution or trust recognized by the government. Well, if that's the case, let's say a candidate has raised $100, but this time you're discontinuing the election. And that person is just a candidate and not so we cannot actually see this as a new election because this is still the same election. You're still running for the 6th-term chief executive. What if that person only has that remaining $50 and is not able to raise another $50 in the new nomination period? So would that be unfair? Because for candidates who really want to run for election because of this regulation would not be able to run in the new nomination period. Well, we can, of course, arrange for this for a new election, but then it must be a new election, but this election actually has not seen a person elected. So it is still the same election. It is still an election of the 6th-term chief executive. We cannot be assured that this candidate will be able to raise this extra $50 in the new nomination period. Well, this is actually not an understanding issue. It's actually the law. Well, yes, it's how you interpret the law. I understand the provisions of the law. But then that is the problem itself, because in March, we are now going for the 6th-term chief executive election. Then for May, you're still picking or electing the 6th-term chief executive. You're not electing the 7th-term chief executive. So that actually is the same election. Chairman, I would have to use the electoral law to explain this, because in accordance with Elections, Corrupt and Illegal Conduct Ordinance, there is a section 3A that provides for two situations. One is that a election has been smoothly carried out and there is someone elected. And secondly, it's the arrangement for a discontinued election. Although we're talking about the same election, there may be two possibilities. One is a smooth election, and secondly is that the election has not been completed. So in the drafting of the law, these two situations have already been considered, even if we are talking about the same election. I did say in the beginning that this is actually not the interpretation of the CMAB. Instead, it is how the provision was drafted, and therefore has nothing to do with interpretation. Well, thank you, Mr. Tang. I understand the law. My point is not on the interpretation of the law. It's how you, in the understanding that it's actually a bit unfair. Let's say a candidate does not have the capability to raise funds for another election. So he spent $50 out of the 100 and he has to donate the remaining 50 to a charity. He has no other means to mobilize more funds for the new nomination period, and that is already unfair to this candidate.
秘書長，
主席，我
Yes, Chairman, I can only say that under Cap 5443 capital letter A, it's applicable to all elections and not only on one particular candidate. So it's actually quite fair because it applies to all elections. And that includes the past Legislative Council election. Thank you. I understand your view, and this may not be under the ambit of us members, but I just want to bring out the unfair arrangement that the candidate only has the means to raise enough funds for one election. I just want to bring out this point. Thank you.
李議員，我諗都穩陣啲，你揾咗啲人捐款俾你。
Dr. Lee, I think that if you're running for election and you found donations, you must ensure that you are not paid in full in one go. You must have it paid in installments. This is force majeure. Well, maybe you're new to election. I've been in this for many years. So you do have to make an estimate when you run an election. Even if I find someone to stand up for me, I would not ask for all the money in one go. So this is something for you to consider. Next, Mr. Chan Pui-Leung. I'd like to follow up on the date of election, May 8th, that this is the only plan and there is no other contingency plan. However, from the nomination period till May 8th, or even if there's a possibility of a second polling day in June, you do not know what would happen because there are many unforeseen circumstances and that can affect our nomination and our election. Would the government consider during this period in case of any problems and that you would need to postpone it again? Do you have any means to postpone it again? Or would the central government be the one to set a date? P.S. I think this question has been asked many times. I think you should give a brief response to that. Thank you. The Hong Kong SAR has only one plan, a very clear plan to hold the election on May 8th. We will try our best to hold this election. However, if there are unresolved issues, much like what happened on March 11th last year, that in Section 8 under the decision made by the NPC, that the Chief Executive of the SAR shall submit in a timely manner reports to the Central People's Government on relevant important situations, including the institutional arrangements for elections of the HKSAR and the organization of the elections. So that's basically the same as before. When the Hong Kong SAR government cannot handle certain matters due to constitutional arrangements, we would, of course, report it to the central government and seek their advice. Thank you. Mr. Chan, any follow-up? No, that's it. P.S. In your opening, you mentioned something which I would like to ask about, but before that, I would like to say that the Liberal Party supports your proposal in the postponement of the CE election. You said that election expenses would be reset. I'm not sure whether I understand you correctly. Let's say I'm running for the election. Let's say I plan to run for the 2025 Legislative Council election. So when I declare this, then in my understanding, I would already begin the running for election. It wouldn't happen after I have been nominated, and that include meal expenses paid for me or by my friends. Are you telling me right now that, or maybe I misunderstood you, that I declared my intention to run in January, and now you're discontinuing the election. Yet I have not yet used up my expenses, so can I now treat the 1,500 EC members to a meal, and that would not be counted as corruption? And then I would declare my intention to run in May. I just want to try to clarify how you count those expenses.
Thank you.
Thank you, Chairman. Let me get back to the articles itself. Your understanding is correct. So whenever anyone they declare that they intend to participate in a certain election, then the Elections Corrupt and Illegal Conduct Ordinance will already define that person as a candidate, and all the articles, including the corrupt conduct and election expenditure, everything immediately applies. And the ordinance also says that before the election, during the election, and after the election, any acts, any expenditure, it will also fall under the purview of the ordinance. The hypothetical that you just asked about is about 2025, right? So in the end, and well, not the chairman yourself, but any candidate, if they do what you mentioned, then the courts would have to make a judgment. When whining and dining, is that whining and dining constitute an offense? Is that whining and dining intended for the 2025 elections? Like in all past cases, it's about what they think, what their intentions are. It's very difficult to abstractly say whether it falls under the purview of the ordinance or not. If, say, some of the things that he or she said obviously shows that they are preparing for the next election, if that's the case, I think that the Ordinance 554 would definitely apply. It's about the intention. So in other words, in November and in December, I have announced that I want to declare my candidacy for the next chief executive election. So any whining and dining or anything that I do with the electoral committee members should not be done. And it doesn't mean... So it doesn't mean that we are suspending the election now. They could do another round of whining and dining, and that wouldn't count. It doesn't work that, right? So the money and the funds would have to be reset. But if you said that you declare your candidacy and you intend to be a candidate, and when you wine and dine your friends, you're saying that, well, I hope that you support, but the 8th of May, you will support me. So there is no limitation on the timeline of how things happen, right? Your understanding is correct because the ordinance is quite clear. Before, during, and after the elections, any action for the sake of a certain election would definitely fall into the scope of Ordinance 554. So it depends on the facts during the case, but your understanding of the principle is correct, Chairman. So, okay, now some of our colleagues have raised their hands to ask a second round of questions. We have Che Wai-chun, Common Conwayman, and Councillor Dick Ji-yun. So first, may I invite Councillor Che Wai-chun. So thank you, Chairman. I have a point I would like to follow up and clarify on with regards to my first question. So the permanent secretary and the documents all said that the elections will be postponed to the 8th of May, and a lot of factors was considered in order to arrive on that date. And well, the date itself is very reasonable. And it also anticipates that even though this is an unlikely event, on the 19th of June, that would be the voting day for the second round of votes. So my understanding is that setting the date on the 8th of May gives some room for further postponement without violating the basic law. Is that a correct understanding? That's what I want to clarify. Thank you. Mr. Roy Tang, please. That's correct. because the current electoral law for the chief executive elections provide a mechanism, and the law anticipates two eventualities. Firstly, the nomination period goes smoothly, and after the nomination period, there are no effective nominations. So there are at least two situations, right? Like nobody declare candidacy, that's a possibility. And secondly, they may have declared a candidacy, but their candidacy was deemed not valid by the EAC. That's an eventuality that could happen in any election. So under the current law, is that if there are no effective nominations after the nomination period, it would immediately trigger another 42-day period, and the second election would be held in the first Sunday after that 40-day period. So secondly, if no one could be elected as this chief executive, we would count another 42-day period, and there would be a new voting day for a second round of votes. In theory, as long as on any Sunday before the 30th of June, we could satisfy the 14-day nomination period, and to vote within the legal time frame of the ordinance. That would be constitute a effective nomination and effective election. Of course, we have to take into consideration the fact that we have practical considerations about nominating the official and asking and seeking appointment from the central government, and that has something we have to consider as well. No follow-up. Thank you, Chairman. So next question comes from Councillor Dik Ziyun. Thank you, Chairman. So the chief executive could be elected by way of consultation. I have reservations about that option, because I think under the current situation, an election would be preferable. And I hope the central government understands, and I hope that the Hong Kong government, apart from fighting the pandemic, they would also guarantee that the election is hosted successfully. And with regards to the election date, several councillors or my colleagues have mentioned that there's a proposal or a confirmation for the government's consideration. From the 8th of May to the 30th of June, there is still some space. This space, under the current legal framework, provides some flexibility for the Hong Kong government to choose other options. So just now, the Permanent Secretary said that the 8th of May is the only option. I wish that the government would consider more options, because the pandemic is difficult to predict, and there would be many different scenarios. Since you have the flexibility and you have other dates to choose from, please, starting today, think about this with your colleagues, think about how to make the amendments. And this is the space you have within the current legal framework. And, if this other option would be preferable, why not consider it first? So if the situation worsens and you choose another date, we have to follow what you say, because we don't have a lot of room to choose from. But if today you come to us and tell us that you have different considerations, you have different options, if you tell it in advance, it will be easier for us to support you in the future. Today, you're giving us one option, and tomorrow, another day, you would give another option for us, and we have forced to choose this option, right? And what I propose makes sense. There are many variables, and there's a room for choosing different things. Why not consider many different factors and arrive at a more flexible plan for us, so that we would understand what's happening, and that would be better. So it's the same answer. So be it for Legislative Council elections, CE elections, or local council elections, we have to follow the law, particularly the basic law. Whenever we make plans, we think about the electoral committee members, our citizens, and the candidates. They must have a fixed schedule in order to plan what they plan to do. So when an administrative body proposes an election date and an arrangement, we will not provide 4 to 6 different options. When we are explaining the laws and what it allows us to do, at the Legislative Council, we would clearly tell the legislative councillors that 8th of May is not the final deadline. That's the fact, and I've told everybody that. But as a matter of planning, we are still moving towards the 8th of May target. Of course, if there are changes in the future, we have to make changes according to the to what happens in the future. Any follow-up? Yes. So you were quite clear. You have a clear target right now. It's the 8th of May, but there are variables, there are changes, and there's room for you to change the date. And my advice, my recommendation, you have to take into consideration when will you make changes, and at least you have an understanding first. So when you come to us and discuss these matters, I would think of you as well prepared and well planned instead of just improvising and play by ear. Thank you for your advice, Councillor. No further follow-up, Chairman. Next, I have Honourable Carmen Kan Wai Man. So I'd like to thank the chairman first. This is a very important topic, and you are giving us a lot of room to discuss this important matter here and now. Permanent Secretary, with regards to your previous answer to my question, I would like to have follow-up in two ways. Firstly, I'm delighted to hear that you have confirmed that the Hong Kong SAR government would like to host the CE election successfully and are doing everything that they can. And therefore, when the government is setting the policies pertaining to the pandemic and the elections, it requires overall coordination. So I mentioned the nomination period is 3rd to 16th of April. That's fixed. So when you mentioned about the 599G ordinance, which stops any congregation of people more than 2 people, and the 599F or limitations as well on venues, I hope that you would be flexible. You don't have to extend all these limitations by 14 days and 14 days every time, because right now that's the power that you have under the law. I would like to hope I hope that the permanent secretary would respond in a clearer manner, saying that under the broader aim and overarching aim of fighting the pandemic and successfully hosting the elections, under the different chapters of 599, we will offer the flexibility necessary for hosting those elections. That's the first point. And secondly, that you mentioned that the 541J ordinance about the polling station issue, that requires the election to be held in one polling station. So if that's a bylaw, the administrative branch could legislate before approval and change that law before you take it up for our consideration. Perhaps one polling station could be expanded into 5 polling stations, or since we have 40 different groups, we could have 40 different polling stations, or you could adopt a more flexible arrangement. But I would like to remind the government, it's not just about the CMAB, the overall, the entire government, in order to control the pandemic properly, you must take into consideration the flexibilities offered by the Chapter 541J. And thirdly, yesterday in your letter dated the 2nd of March, you have not offered an answer with that for our question yet. So I wonder if the CMAB could respond to the questions posed by our legal advisors. Mr. Roy Tang, please. So about the answer to the legal advisor's question, I have offered a simple answer already. So when we are dealing with the matter of which announcements must be cancelled, we will only cancel any announcements pertaining to the chief executive election. So the announcements that the announcement that the legal advisor had brought up have nothing to do with the CE election itself. All of the announcements mentioned by the legal advisor has to do with the nomination of these electoral committee members, the application of these electoral committee members, and the elected electoral committee members, after being vetted by the relevant committee, they were deemed valid. But apart from the validity, there is also another announcement necessary according to the law. So all those announcements has to do with whether or not the electoral committee members could could become electoral committee members. And in my previous answer, I have said that the electoral committee members, according to the current arrangements under the basic law, the election of the chief executive is not their only duty. They also have other duties, including but not limited to the election of 45 different legislative council members. So the 40 legislative council members, which are elected by the 1,400 strong committee elected members, they are still duly elected, so the two have no logical connection between them. That's I just want to reiterate my previous answer. So the issue about more flexibility, we would definitely consider that, as I've previously mentioned. In the last Legislative Council election, we have considered and we have made provisions for with regards to 599G and other chapters of the Cap 599, when it comes to limiting election activities, we would consider offering exemptions for elections. We could totally do that. We have even drafted the relevant law. When it comes to more polling stations, I would like to explain the arrangements pertaining to the CE elections under the current legal system. So right now, the law stipulates that the elections must be completed within 1 day. So without changing the law, we must follow the law, right? So if there are more polling stations, what will happen? We would have more than one candidate may not be no candidate may be able to obtain more than 750 votes, and the law would stipulate that you have to conduct the second round and third round of votes. If we have many different polling stations, then it will take a lot of time for us to count the votes, because you have to congregate all the votes into a central polling station, open the polling boxes and everything. So that may mean that the second round of vote will have to start at a very late hour, and we may not be able to host the third round of votes. So the design of the electoral system, all the designs of all these electoral laws have a clear target. We must be able to do everything within 1 day. So all of these situations would require us to perform the election in the most efficient manner within that day. So if we have many polling stations, we may risk a very long, lengthy vote counting period.
Any follow-up? Chairman, I understand the justifications given, but then we are now in uncertain times. So therefore, we need to look into these abnormal circumstances. We need to look into what you said, and my understanding is that the legal notice published would not be affected. Therefore, you would not need to raise the validity of the EC members. Thank you. Yes, you're correct. No follow-up, right? Legal advisor, your hand is raised. You have anything to add? Thank you, Chairman. I'd like to also thank the very clear explanations of the PS. I just have some follow-up in relation to LN22. I'd like to ask about some of the wordings used, because there's a definition of legislative affairs, and that it should be made in accordance with 83(6) under Cap 554. So would that include what has been mentioned previously? Second question. The legal notices I mentioned are on the Gazette on running candidates. So if these are under cap 569 bracket 8 and not be affected by the change in the election date, would the administration consider that in that section 3 of LN to state clearly that this would not be affected?
專員係咪冇開聲定係點？
你聽唔聽到法律顧問問你嘅？
Did you hear the question by the legal advisor? Yes, I heard it very clearly. I want to ask Mr. Mui to take this question.
多謝主席。
Thank you, Chairman, and thank you, legal advisor, for your follow-up. Let me try to explain the legal understanding. And if necessary, my colleague can also further clarify the matter. We are now invoking the Emergency Regulations Ordinance, which is Legal Notice 22. Actually, it is very clear on what we mean by that. You can take a look at B260. There's actually A and B, and in A it said it is actually a behavior set out in the election. And on the same page, it also defines that it is in relation to legal matters in relation to the election of the chief executive. Therefore, under these definitions, on any notices related to the electoral matters, I believe that the regulation under LN 22 has already a very clear stipulation that will not affect the regulations under the election committee. Perhaps my colleague can also add on. Thank you. We've already heard the explanations given by Mr. Mew. I just need to add on section 4 bracket 2 on electoral matters not being in effect. Those include matters on the discontinued election will cease to have effect. The administration has already explained that it is not directly related to the election committee. It's more related to the constituency of the EAC. So actually the legal notices would not be affected. Any follow-up?
我冇跟進。
Thank you. I do not have follow-up and like to thank the administration for the clarification. All right, members, we only have a few minutes left and we have still not yet started our clause-by-clause scrutiny. I'd like to ask members, I believe we'll need to at least hold another meeting to examine the provisions of the regulation. And I also think that there is a need to consult the public. I'm not sure whether members are in favor of that. If there are no objections, I would ask the Secretariat to put the consultation online, and then at the next meeting, well, I hope we'll be able to hold a meeting next week to start examining the provisions. The Secretary will send out a memo to all members, and we will need to try to work out a time that works for everyone. If you have no further questions, we would conduct a public consultation online, and I do not have any other business. I declare the meeting closed. Thank you.